Okay, we're on chapter 6, the last chapter of Hinds' feet on high places. When Much Afraid woke from a deep and peaceful sleep, there was no sign of sorrow and suffering. Neither was there any sign of her enemies. High above her was a cloudless sky and the peaks of the high places, which shone dazzling white. She went to explore the canyon and found it to be warm and quiet. The ground was a soft carpet of green grass and sweet-smelling flowers. There was a great waterfall tumbling down into a river that was as clear as crystal. She went and dipped her fingers into the water, then stepped into one of the rocky pools. It felt so good. It was as if she was in a stream of bubbling life. When she finally stepped out of the water and stood on the mossy bank, she happened to look down at her feet. They were beautiful. The crooked, ugly feet were gone. Then she remembered how the shepherd had spoken of the healing streams in the high places. Quickly, she stepped back into the pool and put her head under the clear waters and splashed them all over her face. Then she found another little pool among the rocks, still and clear as a mirror. Kneeling down, she peered into the water. The twisted mouth had disappeared. The face that looked back at her was as perfect and beautiful as that of a little child. For 3 days, Much Afraid felt as though she were wrapped in peace and happiness. She wandered around the little canyon, eating the delicacies, the berries, and bathing in the water and resting on the mossy banks. On the morning of the 3rd day, she woke suddenly from her sleep with a shock of joy tingling through her. Someone had called her name. She had not heard a voice, but she knew she had been called. She stood up and waited, but the only sound was the rushing waterfall. Then it came again, tingling through her, a call ringing down from someplace high above. She looked around excitedly. She felt like running up the mountains, but where was the way out of the canyon? The rocky walls were steep and straight. Then she saw 2 deer like the one she had seen that day at the foot of Mount Injury. The hart was springing up the walls of the canyon, followed closely by the hind. Much Afraid did not wait another minute. With a flying jump, she reached the edge of the wall. Then, using the same footholds as the hart and the hind, she went leaping up the cliff. Very quickly, she reached the top of the canyon, and she went on higher still toward the place that the call had come from. She leaped excitedly from rock to rock to the top of the mountain. There was the shepherd standing on the peak just as she knew he would be. But he wasn't dressed like a shepherd now. He was wearing a crown and royal robes, and his face shone with joy. He held out both hands and called to her with a great laugh. "You with the hind's feet, jump over here." She gave one last flying spring and landed beside him on the top of the mountain. "At last," he said as she knelt at his feet, "at last you are here. Your night of sorrow and weeping is over, and joy comes to you in the morning. The flower of love is blooming in your heart. It is time for you to receive your new name, as I promised. From now on, you are Grace and Glory." She couldn't speak, but was silent with joy and thanksgiving, and with awe and wonder. Gently, the shepherd king helped her to her feet. "Now, Grace and Glory, give me the bag of stones that you collected on your journey." She took the bag and passed it to him. He asked her to hold out her hands, and he emptied what was inside. She gasped with delight. Instead of the plain little stones that she had put in her bag, out fell a heap of sparkling jewels. The king took each of the precious gems and set them on a fine circlet of gold. As she watched, Grace and Glory remembered how she had almost thrown the stones away. She thought of how she almost stopped trusting his promises. She was very happy that she hadn't done either. He placed the crown upon her head. "Now you are a daughter of the king, Grace and Glory," he said. "Now you are to live with me here on the high places. You will go where I go and share my work in the valley below. I have 2 helpers for you." When Grace and Gloria heard those words, her eyes almost filled with tears. She remembered Sorrow and Suffering, the faithful friends he had given her before. It was through their help and gentle patience that she had been able to reach the high places. They had gone through the same hard journey, and now she was here and they were not. She turned to the king to beg him to let her have them again for her helpers instead of someone new. But before she could speak, he smiled and said, "Here are the handmaidens I have chosen to be with you forever." 2 shining figures stepped forward. They wore white gowns that sparkled in the morning light. They were tall and strong and very beautiful. They came toward her with love shining from their eyes. "Who are you?" Grace and Glory asked softly. "Will you tell me your names?" Instead of answering, they looked at each other and smiled. Then they held out their hands as if to take hers. Grace and Glory cried out in joy, "Why, you are Sorrow and Suffering! I was longing to find you again." They shook their heads. "Oh, no," they laughed. "We are no more Sorrow and Suffering than you are much afraid. Don't you know that everything that comes to the high places is changed? Since you brought us here, we have become joy and peace." "Brought you here?" she asked. "Why, it was you 2 who dragged me here." Again they shook their heads and smiled. "No, we could never have come here alone. Sorrow and Suffering cannot enter the kingdom of love. But each time you accepted us and took our hands, we began to change. Now we are to be your friends and helpers forever." They put their arms around her and hugged her tightly. So with a new name and a glittering crown on her head, Grace and Glory came to the high places and entered the kingdom of love with joy and peace as her friends forever. The end. Actually, it's not the end. Let me read something about spending some quiet time. Think about this. There is so much in this short part of our story. I've listed verses below for you to look up. Think about each one as you read it. Think about Much Afraid's journey. Your life is like a journey. You will go through times of loneliness, trouble, and pain. You will have seasons of peace and happiness, but always walk with the Shepherd King. Trust him to lead you on the best pathway, even though you may not understand why or where he's taking you. One of my favorite Bible verses is Philippians 1:6. He who has begun a good work in you will complete it. The shepherd had planned to make Much Afraid's feet like Hinds' feet, to bring her to the high places, and to crown her with a new name. He also has a plan for your life. It's a very good plan. Now back to the very end of the story. The high places where Grace and Glory and her handmaidens had entered were not the highest of all. Others towered over them up into the sky, further than their eyes could see. Those were the highest places, where the king's servants went after their earthly life was over. There were many, many other mountain ranges in every direction also. Grace and Glory gasped in awe and wonder, realizing that there was so much more to see, so much more to learn. The king himself trained Grace and Glory and her friends to use their hinds feet. Instead of bounding ahead with his great strength, he carefully took only small leaps and jumps so that they could keep up with him. Grace and Glory hardly even wanted to stop to rest. Her whole life had been spent limping and struggling, and now she was leaping from rock to rock on hinds feet. Finally, one day, she was so tired that she dropped down laughing and breathless on a mossy rock. "I guess even hinds feet need a rest now and then," she laughed. The king sat beside her. "Grace and Glory, do you know how I was able to make your feet like hinds feet and set you on these high places?" She sat up and moved closer to him. "How were you able to do this, my king?" "Think back over the journey you made," he answered. "Tell me what lessons you learned on the way." For a long time, Grace and Glory sat without speaking. She thought about the whole journey, which at times had seemed so hard, even impossible. She thought of the altar she had made along the way and of the little stones she picked up each time she laid down her own desire to follow his. She remembered the pool in the valley where he had called her to follow him to the mountains. She remembered her first meeting with sorrow and suffering and how she learned to let them help her. She thought of having to go down to the desert, away from the mountains, then of walking by the sea of loneliness. Then there was Mount Injury and the forest of danger and tribulation, and the days spent in the little hut during the great storm. She remembered walking through the mist and then finally arriving at the canyon of full surrender. At last she put her hand in his and said softly, "My Lord, I will tell you what I learned." "Tell me," he answered gently. "First," she said, "I learned that I must accept with joy every path that you lead me on and everything that you let happen to me. I am not to try to get away from what you want for me. I am to lay down my own desires and be your little handmaiden, acceptance with joy." He nodded without speaking, and she went on. "Then I learned that I must forgive when others are allowed to hurt me. I am to say, 'Here I am, your little handmaiden, bearing with love.' Then I will have the power to bring good out of the bad things that happen to me." He nodded again, and she smiled happily. "The third thing I learned was that you, my shepherd king, never looked at me as I was, weak and crooked and fearful. You saw me as I would be when you had done what you promised. You always treated me as though I was already the king's daughter and not poor little Much Afraid." She stopped and looked up into his face. "Oh, King, I want to treat others the way you have treated me." He smiled at her with a very lovely smile and nodded for her to keep on. The fourth thing was really the first lesson I learned up here on the high places. Everything that happens in life, no matter how crooked and ugly it may seem to be, can be changed if I treat it with love, forgiveness, and obedience to your will. You let us meet with the bad and the wrong things that you want changed. Maybe that is why we are in this world. You want the sorrow and suffering, the ugly and wrong things, to be made into something beautiful. You want us to overcome evil with good. At last he spoke. "You have learned well. Because of these lessons, I was able to change you from limping, crippled, much afraid, into grace and glory with Hinds' feet. Now you can run and leap on the mountains. So remember this, as long as you are willing to be acceptance with joy and bearing with love, you can never again be crippled, and you will be able to go where I lead. Now use your hind feet again. I am going to lead you to another part of the mountain." Off he went, leaping on the mountains and skipping on the hills, with grace and glory following close behind. Joy and peace went along, springing beside her, and together they sang another song from the king's great book. The king brought them to a beautiful, flowery meadow filled with quiet gardens and fruit trees. They spent several days watching the king's gardeners working carefully with the plants and the vines. One day, Grace and Glory and her friends went for a walk and found themselves on the very edge of the high places. The great waterfall was thundering loudly beside them. From where they stood, they could see right down into the low places far below. There they saw a long, green valley between two chains of mountains. There was a river winding through the valley like a ribbon of light. Here and there were patches of brown and red, which seemed to be houses and villages surrounded with trees and gardens. Suddenly, Grace and Glory knew what they were looking at. It was the valley where she had lived for so long. She sat down on the grassy slope and remembered her home. She thought of the little white cottage where she had lived and the pastures where the shepherds cared for their flocks of sheep. In that valley were her friends and fellow workers for the shepherd. She thought of her neighbor, Mrs. Valiant, and smiled. On the outside edge of the village was the cottage where her Aunt Dismal Forebodings lived, and where she had grown up with her cousins, Gloomy and Spiteful, and their brother, Craven Fear. She saw the homes of her other Fearing's relatives, including the big old house of Lord Fearing. There was the house where Pride lived, and near it were the homes of bitterness and resentment, and under those dark trees lived self-pity. She thought of those who had been her enemies on her journey to the high places, and of others who lived in the valley, people who hated the shepherd, people who refused to follow his ways. As Grace and Glory sat looking down into the valley, her eyes filled with tears and her heart ached with pain. If the king can change much afraid into grace and glory, and if sorrow and suffering can become joy and peace, surely something can be done for my fearing relatives, she cried. At that very moment, the king came and stood with them. Grace and Glory could hardly say her words quickly enough. "Oh, king, my relatives down there in the valley, they are so empty and miserable. What can we do for them? They don't know anything about the high places and the kingdom of love. Will you find a way to rescue them as you rescued me?" The king looked at her kindly and with great happiness. He said, "I am very willing to do just that, Grace and Glory, but those unhappy people won't let me into their homes. They don't even want me to speak to them. They need someone to speak for me." "I see what you mean," she cried joyfully. "We, Joy and Peace and I, will go down and show them what you have done for us. We will tell them what you can do for them." "Do you think they will listen to you?" he asked, smiling gently. "No, I don't think they will, at least not at first," she answered. "I didn't act very nicely toward them before, but you will help me. You will teach me what to say." Then Grace and Glory looked over at the great waterfall, which joyfully sang the water songs as they poured themselves forth, singing, "Come, oh come, let us away, lower and lower every day. From the heights we leap and flow to the valleys far below, always answering to the call to the lowest places of all." Suddenly she understood. She was only one of the many, many servants of the king who had been brought to the high places. She was only one drop among the millions of self-givers who could now pour out their lives like the waterfall. "He brought me here for this," she whispered to herself. The king nodded. Then he began leaping and springing down the mountainside before them, choosing leaps that they could easily follow. Behind him went Grace and Glory with Joy and Peace beside her. The one who had been much afraid was returning to the valley to tell everyone who would listen about the shepherd king and what he had done for her.